Josef Mengele became one of the world's most wanted Nazi war criminals, and for a good reason. This was the Auschwitz doctor whose selection sent countless people to the gas chambers. Yet he escaped justice for 34 years. Not simply because he disappeared, but because his wealthy Bavarian family repeatedly financed his life in hiding, misled investigators, and helped him survive in South America for decades. What does a good family protect when the person they're protecting is a mass murderer? Spring of 1943 brought Josef Mengele to Auschwitz-Birkenau, an SS captain with a medical degree and a fascination with human difference that would define the rest of his life. For the next 2 years, he stood on the camp's arrival ramp, deciding with a small gesture of his hand who would work that day and who would die. And historians place the number of people he sent to the gas chambers somewhere in the hundreds of thousands. Twins held a particular grip on his attention, and he pulled children away from their parents for experiments that maimed and killed, chasing genetic theories built to fit his beliefs about racial hierarchy. The nickname stuck fast among prisoners who survived his selections, the Angel of Death. He slipped away from Auschwitz on the 17th of January, 1945, days ahead of the advancing Soviet army, and disappeared into the collapse of the Third Reich, along with thousands of other fleeing officers. American soldiers picked him up that spring and briefly held him as an ordinary prisoner of war, with no idea who he actually was. Most SS men carried a small tattoo marking their blood type, and guards checked for it routinely, but Mengele had none, and that single missing detail bought him his freedom within months. Nearly 4 years passed after that, and he lived quietly under his own name the entire time, working as a farmhand a short distance from the town where he'd been born. The world's most wanted man was renting a room in Bavaria, and that fact shaped everything that followed, because his escape from justice never really began in some distant hideout. It began at home, with people who already knew exactly who he was. Günzburg had learned to respect the family that hid this man in plain sight. Karl Mengele, his father, had built a small foundry into one of Germany's largest manufacturers of threshing machines, a firm that by the 1930s shaped the entire economy of the town. Discipline mattered in that household, and the family name carried real weight, since Josef was the eldest of 3 sons raised inside it. He married Irene Schoenbein in July of 1939, and in March 1944, while stationed at Auschwitz, he became a father to their only child, a son named Rolf. Barely knowing him, Rolf grew up on a simple story instead of a real father, because Josef had all but vanished from his son's life before it truly began. The family told the boy his father had died somewhere on the Eastern Front, a lie built to shield a fugitive, and for years the story held while Rolf grew up mostly with his mother and grandparents in Freiburg. That family had the wealth and the discipline to keep a secret sealed for exactly as long as it needed sealing. The quiet interlude in Bavaria ran its course by 1949, and here's what changed everything. Investigators were closing in, and staying in Germany had grown too dangerous to risk. That autumn, connections tied to the family firm arranged his escape, and Mengele slipped out of the country along a route already used by fleeing Nazis, bound for Argentina under a false identity he'd carried for years. Germany, it turned out, was a country he would never live in again, and his family was about to follow him across the ocean, one envelope at a time. One man bridged the distance between Günzburg and South America for the next 3 decades, Hans Zedelmeier, a long-time employee of the family firm who carried letters, arranged transfers of money, and traveled to see Mengele in person more than once. Zedelmeier worked as courier between a fugitive and the relatives who had chosen to sustain him, and none of it ever showed up on the company's books. Irene never followed her husband into exile, and instead she stayed behind with their son until the marriage formally ended in 1954. 4 years later, in a quiet ceremony in Uruguay, Josef married Martha, the widow of his own brother Karl, and she brought her young son Karl-Heinz into the household. That boy, as it happened, spent more time around his stepfather than Rolf ever did. Father and son came close exactly once. Mengele traveled secretly to Switzerland in 1956 to visit relatives and spent time with Rolf, though the boy was still kept from the full truth, and neither of them knew it would be more than 20 years before they saw each other again. Everything shifted in 1960 when Israeli agents captured Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires and put him on trial in Jerusalem, proving that no manhunt for a Nazi war criminal ever truly ended. Panic sent Mengele fleeing first to Paraguay and then to Brazil, and he retreated deeper into a life of assumed names with shrinking contact to the world he'd left behind. Back in Bavaria, his family kept the money moving, and they kept quiet too. Rolf Mengele had built a career as a lawyer in Freiburg by the mid-1970s, and piece by piece he'd learned who his father really was and what he had done, which left him wanting to see the man face to face. August 1977 found Rolf flying to São Paulo on a borrowed passport, making his way to a modest house where his father lived under the protection of an Austrian couple who had sheltered him for years. Nearly 2 weeks passed while the two men sat together, and Rolf pressed him about Auschwitz, about the selections, about the children pulled aside for experiments. No remorse showed on his father's face. The man simply insisted he had followed orders and harmed no one directly. Disgust sent Rolf home certain he would never see his father again, and yet he still told no one where the man was hiding. Blood, it turned out, still counted for something, even stripped clean of forgiveness. Mengele's health had been failing for years by the time it caught up with him. On the 7th of February, 1979, while swimming off a beach near Bertioga, he suffered a stroke and drowned, and his hosts buried him under the false name he'd used since the early 1970s, Wolfgang Gerhard. Rolf learned of his death within days, but back in Günzburg, the family absorbed the news and did what it had always done, saying nothing to the press, nothing to prosecutors, and nothing to the thousands still searching for the man who had once stood at Auschwitz gate. 6 more years, and the secret would still hold. 1985 broke the silence after West German police raided Sedlmeyer's home and turned up letters that traced straight back to Brazil. Investigators followed that paper trail to the grave at Embu, and on the 6th of June the remains came up out of the ground. Forensic examiners matched the skeleton against SS medical files, point by point. The height, the gap in the front teeth, an old fracture in the hip, and within days Rolf issued a short statement confirming what the family had concealed for 6 years. He offered sympathy to the victims and their relatives, the first time any Mengele had said anything publicly about Josef's crimes, and a genetic test in 1992 erased whatever doubts still remained. What followed looked less like a scandal and more like a slow unraveling. Rolf gave up the Mengele surname in 1980, taking his wife's name instead to spare his own children the weight their grandfather had left behind, and he spent the rest of his life at a careful distance from a name he had never chosen. The family firm fared little better. Poor harvests, European farm policy, and the Chernobyl disaster battered its finances through the mid-1980s, and by 1986 the Bavarian government had to step in with public money just to keep the place running. The Mengele name stayed bolted to the machinery a few more years, and then it didn't. Ownership changed in 2010, and again in 2017, until nothing remained of the family firm that had once financed a fugitive from Auschwitz. The regime Mengele served collapsed within months of his flight from the camp, and he spent the next 34 years running from a justice that never caught him, kept alive the whole time by a family that chose loyalty over disclosure. Neither the man nor the silence protecting him survived that in the end, fully intact. A different name hangs on the factory gates in Bavaria now, set down by the son who spent his life trying to walk away from it.